My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Adrienne Celt presenting her new novel, End of the World House, in conversation with Kristen Arnett. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community. Upcoming virtual events include Audrey McGee presenting her new novel, The Colony, William Brewer in conversation with Andrew Martin, and Putsata Rayang in conversation with Meghna Chakrabarty. Please check out the event schedule on our website at harvard.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can click on the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many questions as time allows. And also this event will have closed captioning available depending on the version of Zoom that you are using. You may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of End of the World House on harvard.com. Your purchases and financial contributions make the event series possible, make events like tonight's possible, and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Cambridge. We thank you so much for your continuing support through some bonkers few years. So just thank you so much for joining us tonight and for your support, and also for supporting the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And lastly, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, likely have, technical issues may arise. We of course hope that they don't, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers. Adrienne Celt is the author of two previous novels, Invitation to a Bonfire and The Daughters, which won the 2015 PEN Southwest Book Award for Fiction and was named a Best Book of the Year by NPR. Adrienne is also a cartoonist, and she publishes a weekly webcomic at loveamongthelampreys.com. Kristen Arnett is the author of the novel With Teeth, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in Fiction, and the New York Times bestselling debut novel Mostly Dead Things, which was also a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in Fiction. Her work has appeared at the New York Times, BuzzFeed, Time, PBS NewsHour, The Guardian, and elsewhere. Tonight, they will be discussing Adrienne Celt's new book, End of the World House. The novel, set against an apocalyptic backdrop of climate disaster and global conflict, follows two women named Bertie and Kate, who have been best friends since high school. They take a trip together to Paris as a sort of last hurrah before Kate moves away from Bertie and, if they're being honest, before the world ends. After a strange encounter at a bar, they find themselves alone in the Louvre after hours. Then that day repeats itself, and then things really get weird. The Los Angeles Times Book Review observes Celt is a smart, convincing novelist, and her ambitious tweaks of the time loop concept are fascinating and fun to grapple with as the novel navigates the loss of a friendship, the kind of pain that can feel like the end of the world. I'm so pleased to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Adrienne and Kristen.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Harvard Bookstore for having us.
Yay, I'm excited. And you're blessing us with a reading tonight. So I am thrilled, and I'm going to mute myself again and let you take the stage and read. And like we were talking about this in like the green room, but like, yeah, it's like, who doesn't love story time? So I will delightedly sit here and drink my drink and listen to you read from this beautiful book.
And I will be happy to do it. So for anyone who hasn't read the book, it was just described so beautifully by Nell, it does engage in time loops. So the days repeat, and it's kind of difficult to pick an excerpt as a result of that. So I have been reading from the beginning, most of the time, but Kristen and I talked about it, and instead I'm going to read the part where Birdie is very drunk. All right. Her memories were hazy and multiple, overlaying one another until she forced them together and made them stay. Birdie drank a glass of red wine very fast and then ordered a whiskey. Oh, and I should preface this by saying she is at an American bar in Paris because she's been abandoned by her friend. Kate had abandoned her, and here she was. So much for their quiet evening of reading, so much for the end of their grand tour. All her life, she'd followed the rules, getting A's on her report card and landing a job that brought in cash. She'd walked the straight and narrow path as if in a game of Candyland, collecting gumdrop after gumdrop with the occasional licorice twist. She'd been nice to Kate almost all the time, and this was what happened. Being nice got you this. But maybe the path hadn't been so straight. Half the whiskey now was gone. Maybe there had been many ways to look at herself from the very beginning, which didn't line so neatly up. Her bar stool, she realized, could spin around, and she spun it now, smiling at the boy seated next to her, to whom she realized she had been talking for some time, describing her confusing evening and telling him to hell with Kate. Who ditches their best friend on vacation, she asked, slurring just slightly, tilting her chin onto her shoulder to maintain eye contact as she twirled. For a man? Who does that? The boy shook his head and frowned, leaning his elbows on the sticky bar. He couldn't have been more than 24, and he wasn't much of a conversationalist, but he was listening to her, and maybe that was enough. He bought her another well whiskey on the rocks and got the bartender to give them a red basket full of salted pretzels. According to the flag patch sewn onto his backpack, he was Australian, though who could say? Wrong bar for Aussies, Bertie said conspiratorially, but don't worry, I won't tell. She took a sip of her drink. Do you know, she said, have you noticed the world is ending? The boy just gaped. Bertie nodded, feeling sage. Even though the world is over, people still want everything to be normal. People still want to do a juice cleanse. As she leaned forward to emphasize juice cleanse, the boy leaned back in astonishment, though it was unclear to Bertie if he was reacting to all that immoderate living or to the fact that Bertie had elbowed over the pretzels, knocking them all across his lap. I just want to shake their shoulders and say, guys, there's no Florida anymore. The KKK has a hold of Mississippi. Sorry, Krista, about Florida. The what? Asked the boy, saying his first words to Bertie. Sorry to all of Australia for that. Or possibly saying his first words to Bertie, or possibly even his very first words of all time. The air shimmered around them. The racists with the hoods! To which the boy said nothing, but did adopt a look of grim understanding. He was definitely Australian. He had that accent like biting a lemon with every word, and he was bronzed all over from surf and sun. Bertie wanted to tell him that the world was not to be relied upon, that the things you trusted would sneak up and sink their teeth into you when you least expected it. But he had so many freckles, and they were so cute, and she kept getting distracted and trying to touch them, which was harder than it should have been, because he kept looking around for the dropped pretzels, putting them one by one back in the basket. Then he started to eat them. The boy was wearing a probably ironic t-shirt screen printed with the words "G'day," or was that just one word? Did it count as a compound if it was technically just misspeaking? She wanted to say again that life as they knew it was over, that friends were not friends and safety was an illusion, but even through the alcoholic fog, she knew how maudlin that would sound. So she bent over and kissed the boy instead, hard on the mouth, and he accepted it, with the same gallantry he'd accepted everything, except perhaps the spilling of the pretzels. They made out for a little while in the bathroom, which was wood-paneled and covered with scratched-on graffiti. It felt good at first. His warm chest, the uneducated roving of his hands. Bertie hitched up her t-shirt, bringing his palms in contact with her skin, and the boy responded by unzipping his pants, an idea about which Bertie shared his enthusiasm. Around them, the words of past occupants screamed in all caps, entreating them to call Zoe, she's a bitch, and announcing, Eiffel Tower, joie de vivre! And Bertie considered, why not joie, given vive? Why not live just a little bit? She made a sudden turn and banged her head against the stall door, cartoon stars emerging before her eyes as cartoon birds tweeted above her. Or maybe she was imagining those? And she simultaneously smacked her elbow into the empty toilet paper dispenser. The boy took this opportunity to put his hands on both of her breasts, and with her funny bone zinging electric within her, she chased him away, catching just enough relief on his face to be furious at him. Because how dare he, after all, think he knew better than she did how embarrassing this all was. Those rules she'd followed, what good had they done her? What good did they do anyone? Her parents had been supposed to live until a very old age. They had both stopped eating red meat and avoided everything unsavory on the internet. They liked Clark Gable movies and ingenious new productions of Fiddler on the Roof that made use of found objects for the prop list and offered costume styling somewhere between David Bowie and the board game Settlers of Catan. They did everything right. And if life was indeed a game of Candyland, then they had fallen into a molasses swamp, one of those random calamities that games were full of if you made the wrong roll of the dice. It sounded cute, but it wasn't. You'd drown in molasses, a painful death. The sticky substance would pour down your throat and fill your lungs like sweet pneumonia, taking with it even the dignity of a final breath. And I will stop there.
Yay! Oh my God. That was the perfect part to read from too. Oh my God. I love it so much. And also, it felt relatable.
Right.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for allowing me to be here with you tonight. I don't need to tell you. It's a delightful book. I will tell you, it's such a good book. I read this book I got an early copy of this book and I had it in my house and I read it in my bathtub. I read the whole thing in my bathtub. I had like one of those trays in front of me and like drinks and like a snack and a candle. Like I was being really classy, I felt like, and like bath salts. And I was like, I'm going to read this book in here. I was going to get started with it. And I started reading it and I stayed in for so long. I kept having like add extra water into it. The water was getting cold. It was like such a really engaging book. And I have like a million questions for you. I'll remind the audience too that if you have questions, and probably your questions are smarter than mine, you can add them into the little Q&A thing if you punch that on the bottom, because I know I'm always guilty too of being like listening and then I'm like, oh shit, I had a question and then I forget to ask it. So anytime you think of a question, you can just pop it in there. Otherwise, I will occupy all of Adrienne's time and that's fine with me. But
we'll find things to talk about.
Yeah. It is like, okay, it's such a gorgeous book and it's doing so many different things, but I love it. I think a good way to start off, and we've already heard like such a good like pitch about like what the book is about. I was like, oh my God, I wish we all had that for like all of our events. Somebody talking so beautifully and succinctly about like the themes and like main points of our books. I was like, oh my God, I need somebody to do that for me all the time. That was delightful. But if you would like talk, maybe start at a good starting off point would be to talk about like the genesis of this book or like how it started with you. And then if you could talk to like about the shape of it, because I think the shape of a novel is something I think about a lot. And this novel has a very interesting shape to it.
Yeah. No, that's great because the genesis and the shape were kind of a combo affair. I had been kicking around, ideas for a next novel, and I knew I was interested in writing something that was more contemporary because my last book was a historical novel set in the 20s and 30s, and it had a really particular affect to it because it was playing with the language of Vladimir Nabokov. I love voice and I love sound and language, and I wanted to see what that would look like to play with in a contemporary setting. And I was doing what I often am doing, which is walking my dog and listening to podcasts. It was probably a little bit of a faster walk than it is now because he's old and so he walks really slow, but the podcasts remain the same. And I had one of those really random, beautiful, intuitive, creative moments where I heard somebody on the podcast say something. They were misspeaking actually, and they said the phrase "private Louvres," and they immediately corrected themselves, but I just sort of turned off the podcast and started thinking because I was like, private Louvres, private loves, private lives, and for whatever reason that made me think about what it would be like to be in a museum with my best friend. And then from there it became an empty museum, and the days repeating, and like what kind of trouble would they get up to day after day if they were stuck there repeating the same thing. And what really excited me about that, so often I'll have a random idea for a book or a story, and I will either forget it or I will think it sounds too hard, which probably is what my reaction should have been to the idea of writing a time loop novel set in the Louvre during the apocalypse. But I really liked the idea of a book in which the shape and form and structure provides some of the engine of the book, both mechanically and also emotionally. And that is the case when you're writing a repeating day. Part of the suspense, like built in, is, okay, so is it going to happen again? Is it going to keep happening? Wait, is this really happening? Am I getting it right? And you have to pay really, a little slightly closer attention. And to me, that was a really fun challenge because it made me very invested, not only in the structure of the book, but also in like the momentary, like the moment to moment events that were happening, even on a very small scale. Because I had to think of ways to signal to the reader, like, okay, this is the same day, slightly different.
Right.
Like to make sure that people were caring about, like, okay, what is happening in the courtyard of the Louvre? I remember that from last time. Wait, do I remember it happening quite like this? And that again provides like the little kernels of suspense.
Yeah. I mean, I found it fascinating. I mean, from a reader's perspective, like, right, because it is like one of those things where it's like, oh, it's just like I was saying, I was like, it was like deeply enjoyable to like sit and be like, okay, it's like compulsively readable, and I want to like keep going and like find out what happens next. But from like a craft thing, I know I just said from craft and hold my hand. Which is, I was like, I'm gonna put a beer in it now because that was like really embarrassing. But like from a craft perspective, as a writer, I was like, this is impressive to me because there are those things, right? Like my writer's like little reptile brain was like seeing like the things. And I did wonder, I mean, I wondered, so now I get to ask you because I'm like basically holding you hostage here. But is like, what did you do to do that? Like, was there like, because it's like, I would imagine that if you did have an outline, it would be really Frankenstein and kind of like strange trying to put those things together. And I love that idea. Like, I love the idea of like a monstrous outline or like a monstrous kind of like document that would hold like, right. Like, how do you remember? Were you like, I mean, I could speculate, like, if you didn't do that, did you have to like continually like look back at what you'd already written to kind of like, make sure the comparisons were like similar enough or just touching in kinds of ways, or like what did you do like structurally to like make sure those things held?
A couple of different things. I did sort of outline the book. So what I did was, once I had the idea, I had some sense of where I wanted it to go, which was not ultimately where it actually went, as so often happens. But I did what I usually do for the second draft of a book, which is I wrote out the plot that I foresaw beat by beat on note cards and put them up on a big bulletin board, because I was at a writing residency when I started this book, and kind of when I finished it, a different one though. And so I would just like not every second of the book was there, but like every time the scene changed, I had some idea of where it went. And if I wrote something in that wasn't on one of those cards, I would just add a card. So I had some idea of where I was going. And that gave me enough stability to know, like, okay, they're going to be in the museum for this amount of time. They're going to go to these places. And then it's going to start again. That I could be pretty fluid within the actual scenes once I was writing them. And I found it to be really fun to leave those little breadcrumbs for readers. I didn't have to, I mean, I had so many notebooks for this book. I probably did write them down, but I didn't like make a list of them at the outset. Once I had written, one of the scenes where this happens a lot, like I mentioned, is the courtyard outside the Louvre. Yes. And so all of the different sets of people who are there and the different things that Birdie and Kate see become this evolving set of little signposts. And it was fun to tweak them. It was, there was a limited enough number of things that were taking place then that I was able to just say like, oh, okay, I can change these. I can make them, I can adjust these. And if they're notable enough to me to pay attention to, I think they will be notable enough to readers.
Yeah.
And then of course I had to go, like once I had written the whole book, every time I revised it, all of that had to shift, and I had to like add some stuff in and take some stuff out.
Yeah.
But it was, yeah, so it ended up being a weird mix of totally intuitive, fluid free writing and absolutely agonizing revisions and note taking.
I mean, it's like, because I was like, oh, like thought wise, like reading the book as like just from you know, it was like a pleasurable experience, but then also, yeah, like my little lizard brain being like, okay, like what would it look like? Because I was thinking about in terms of revision, because it was also like I could feel the fun that you were having doing it, because I think it's like it sits there inside the prose, like it's very it's enjoyable, and you can tell that you're having fun with it. And I think from a reader's perspective, it's a fun thing to engage with, to be like it's not necessarily, I mean, it is, it's got like mystery element to it that feels like I'm like, you feel like you're uncovering things as like, you know, the characters are like kind of like, okay, here's what you get to know now, and like knowing this thing allows you to know this next thing. But it was something too where I was like, oh man, revision would be such a shit show. I was like thinking about it, and like, oh god, like, right, like if you like change like one whole thing, it would end up having to be, I really was having like a moment in my own brain thinking about, it made me think about a lot of stuff though. But then I was also like, damn, what a fun kind of writing exercise. Because I was like, I think like the idea of a writing exercise sounds like it could be tedious, but I love the idea of a writing exercise, especially something like, okay, like if we're thinking about like, right, those like highlights magazine where you have like the two pictures next to each other, things that are different in the photo. I was like thinking a lot about that. And I was like, I mean, because it's a very visual book. I mean, it's got, I mean, obviously we like to talk about art and all the different things, but it's like, it's a visual book. So I was thinking about it in terms of like this kind of like, right, like what's different? It's still the same picture, but things have changed, and you have to figure out like what is different, like, you know, like spot the difference.
I definitely thought about it that way too. I'm not sure, people have asked me before, you've probably gotten this question too, like who would you cast out of people, you know, like movie stars to be in your book? And I'm really bad at that, because I very rarely have, I feel like I have a relationship to the characters that is like more connected than just a visual fan casting, and also somehow less visual. But I thought that one of the big influences of this book was movies that I enjoy, that I feel like do a similar thing in terms of skirting the edge of comedy and the absurd. So like Being John Malkovich, or obviously Groundhog Day.
Right.
And one of the things that that's noticeable to me in those movies, in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of like readers or viewers being able to spot things in that Where's Waldo kind of a sense, is that like, you can scratch that itch, and you don't have to be incredibly subtle about it. Like just the fact that it is there at all, it ends up being kind of subtle. And when I'm watching a movie like that and I see one of those moments, it can be like, especially when it's a little bit funny or a little bit unsettling, it can be very straightforward. And I'm like, I noticed that. And I'm like, oh, right, I have a master's degree.
You look like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think being too subtle for my own good is something that I've been guilty of in short fiction, especially sometimes. And it was like, because I was thinking about it really visually and like filmically, it gave me that gave me a good way of approaching those moments.
Yeah. I mean, because it is, like, you must have gotten a million questions on this tour just about Groundhog Day, I would imagine, right? Because it is like, when we think about like, I mean, when I was like thinking about your book, it is like one of those things that pops to your mind. Like, I didn't really think about as many novels necessarily that do that, even though I know that there's ones that do it and they do that very well. But I was thinking a lot about this kind of visual thing, which I think makes sense too, in terms of like, if we're thinking about art in that kind of way, because that's another question I have. I mean, because you are an artist also, like a visual artist. And so it's like, that was fascinating to me in terms of like what you're doing in this book, because it's like you're in a major gallery, like a massive important like art gallery, and you are having to describe a lot of different kinds of very important art and like what that looks like alongside, right, this kind of trajectory of like, oh, the day is starting over again, and how much do these people know? So I was interested to know if you wouldn't mind like talking about it a little bit, like from your artist brain, like what it was like. Did you like feel like, because I mean, because you are like engaged with art, like, so it's like, was it like writing it in, did you feel like, okay, like I feel like this is like a comfort level for me, or were you like, okay, this is a challenge for me, or you were like, how will I like incorporate this into this space? Because I was like, I was really impressed, because I was like, that would be hard. Like,
oh, thank God.
I'm like from a research standpoint, I was like, shit, I'm like describing like what like very important pieces of art look like, or what's going on with them, and like having to do it repeatedly, and like also a lot of it, I was like, that's tough. And you're like having to do it over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think I came to it in two ways. One is that I love being in a museum, and I love the immersive, like very individual relationship that you can have with a piece of art when you're right in front of it. Like there's something really beautiful about the fact that both of the feeling that like you're alone together in this museum surrounded by people, but you're having a very one-on-one interaction with the art.
Mm-hmm.
And then also that you don't necessarily have to know almost anything about it to appreciate it and have a really deep experience with it. And so I don't know if I thought about it as a comfort level thing, but I thought about it as a very pleasurable thing. Like I would love to be in the Louvre, and I would love to be looking at this art. So that was one starting point. And I went to the Louvre. I had already written a couple of drafts by then. I had been before, but like it's a great excuse to have to write something off on your taxes. And then also the Louvre has a really wonderful online like interactive thing, website, some would call it.
You may have heard of that before. It's a little term that I'm going to throw out there. It's called a website.
For when you're surfing the World Wide Web.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was able to pull up a bunch of the pictures and look at them and like spend time with them in my home while I was working on the book, and that was helpful.
Yeah.
But something that I found challenging was that the other way that I was approaching it was specifically through the lens of Birdie, she's a cartoonist and I'm a cartoonist, but she's a classically trained painter and I'm very much not. So I was just trying to give myself a little bit of an education in some of the ways that she might be thinking about art at the same time as I was writing about it. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that I did that was I drew some pictures of my own of the pictures in the Louvre that I now have.
Amazing.
And I ended up also illustrating a bunch of scenes from the book too, some of which now aren't in the book anymore.
Wow.
It means my studio contains this weird alternate world version of the book.
That feels very in keeping thematically.
It is. Yeah. Many of those things like emerged in terms of weird synchronicities. And I mean, that's one that I sort of started myself, but still. But the thing, as you mentioned, in terms of like the fact that I had to write about a lot of art and write about that same art a lot of times, that did end up feeling really challenging to me because I got really worried that people would be bored. Mm-hmm. That it seems like this beautiful idea at the outset that like, oh, it's one of the most beautiful places on earth and these two best friends are there at the end of the world and it's empty, so they're having this gorgeous, earth-shattering experience in the silent halls of the museum. But then you realize that like one of the great things about in writing generally is if things feel slow to you, you just like have them run into somebody or have somebody throw a drink on them or like have them interact with other people, basically, right. The characters that you're writing. And that was an avenue that was closed off to me because of the choices that I'd made with my life and my book. And so I had to, that was part of how I thought about continuing the narrative propulsion of the book in terms of the day repeating and the museum repeating. Like I had to be very mindful of like, are they looking at the art differently today? Are they looking at different art on this different day?
Yeah.
In terms of like how the book is structured, I made choices like the second chapter, even though it's the same day again, it starts earlier than the first chapter does. So it's Bertie and Kate are experiencing the same thing, but the reader gets to experience something new. And that was also how I tried to approach it within the museum. Is like, okay, these are all of what we're looking at. Like, it's very nice to look at the museum, but readers don't really just want me to describe pictures. They want to have me describe pictures as the characters are experiencing them.
Right.
So like when Bertie and Kate get into a fight, they look at different kinds of pictures than they would pay attention to when they're getting along and
Right.
that sort of thing. And that became the solution to that challenge.
That's amazing though. I like, it's one of those things where it's like right where you're writing where you're like, aha, this is so neat. It's such a great idea. And then you're like, I've written myself into a hole a little bit. Like, how do I rectify this situation? And it was like, basically it's like, I guess we're digging a tunnel with a tiny spoon. But it's like, because it is like fascinating. Also, it's like, it makes a really good point where it's like the idea of like her being like doing these cartoons, because that's something that I was really interested in. She's somebody who's an artist, but she's like doing this job, like, right? It's like for tech. And it's like very outside of the idea of like how we think about like art or embracing like things like that.
Purity, not selling out.
Yeah, or like capitalism or things like that. And so like corporate life, and that is something that's like very much engaged with in this book, that I was like, this is like the ways that like art, like a lot of times to make a living, like ends up like intersecting in this kind of way. And it's like her like drawing this same like character like over and over again in these like different ways, and she's very good at it. And I was like, I love this idea, because I was like, that's also, again, I want to say like deeply relatable. It's this idea of like, right, like I guess I'm going to make art in this kind of way, because this is like the only way I can feel like it's giving me any kind of like financial freedom or any kind of like stability or something like that. So always I get to write like, because they're juxtaposed against each other, and it's like these wildly disparate kind of ideas of like how to engage with like art, but also they also overlap. So it was like that, like to write those things in, because I thought that those scenes of her like being like, well, I'm doing this, you know, was like some fascinating. Like some of the most like very like heartbreaking kind of, I guess, because it's like, right, like coming into it from like an artist standpoint, it's like this feeling of being like, ah, man, like the idea of like having like a lot of potential, or you know, like what it looks like, and then also being like, well, this is what I do, you know, this is the way I do it, and like not completing like she's like working on like her own like art, her own kind of thing, and it's like not really even working on it because she's just remaking the dinosaur every day.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example of what I was talking about in terms of the book's structure, getting at the core of the book and like the heart of the book too, because one of the big themes that I see in the book is stuckness and like inertia in a lot of different ways, which is a huge part of Bertie's relationship to her day job, where she is, you know, doing corporate art. She is illustrating for a tech company, and so she's drawing their dinosaur avatar over and over and over again. And he has become he, it, they. We're going to go with they, because as is established in the book, the dinosaur is technically genderless.
That's right.
The dinosaur became one of my favorite characters in the book, because it sort of emblemizes the fact that when you repeat something over and over again, it can become really tedious or painful or like soul stripping, but it can also become something that you kind of fall in love with and find a lot of comfort in.
Yeah.
And for Bertie, that is very much the case, because it's this job that she gets right out of college, and she went to art school. So she doesn't have any reason to believe really that she'll be able to make money at the thing that she has studied. And she finds that she is able to. And that opened up this, but it does end up kind of killing her drive to be creative on a personal level. And that opened up this parallel between her and Kate's experience of the art in the Louvre, which is a totally different experience of art and capitalism intersecting, and like art and curation intersecting, and just the way that people are forced by living in a capitalist society. And I don't even mean to sound too soapboxy about this. I find it really interesting. the way that artists living in the society that we live in are forced to engage with selling their work and valuing their work monetarily or like socially in some way. And there's just really no escaping it. And like one way you can do that is to be satisfied by producing work within a corporation, like Birdie does for the tech company she works at. And she's not really satisfied by it, but I personally was very satisfied by writing the different scenes for the dinosaur, because that was a lot of fun. And I have worked in tech, so I know what it's like from the marketing writer's perspective, copywriter's perspective, to be like, okay, what are we doing? Let's talk with the illustrators. And it can be like, it becomes a really fun game, but it can be harder to find personal satisfaction with it, because you're ultimately there in order to express the vision of not only another person, but like a non-person.
Right.
Because a company is not a person, it's a collection of people.
Right.
But they don't have one particular ego that is being the force at work. And on the other hand, you have all of this art at the Louvre, like the Mona Lisa, which is on my t-shirt.
Yeah, there it is. There it is.
I thought it would be more visible, but I guess the Zoom window doesn't really allow it. I also wore this at the LA Times Book Fest, and I think I made some joke about it. And I think that the people in the audience couldn't see the shirt, and they were like, they didn't get it. And then when they came in, some people laughed, but then at the book signing line, they were like, oh, I get it now. But so the art at the Louvre also has this weird intersection with capitalism and social capital, in that somebody has chosen it to be there and chosen it to be emblematic of, you know, all of what is great and beautiful about society and humanity, but leaving out so much additional beautiful, magnificent work, some of which is literally just like in a closet at the Louvre or at any museum. You know, their archives are always much bigger than what is actually on display. And I just can't stop thinking about this, because as an artist, you are always working on the very primal level where you're connected to when I'm writing, and I'm writing well, I feel almost like I am tapping into an alternate universe, as Birdie does in this book. And it doesn't, I don't think about it in terms of like, how's it going to sell? How are people going to read it? Obviously that comes in when you're revising it, because you want people to be able to understand it and engage with it. But I don't choose my topics in that way.
Yeah.
And yet there is the necessity of having other people interact with your work. And once a piece of work gets a little bit of attention, it can get more attention, and it can get more attention, and it snowballs until its sense of importance comes somewhat from the fact that people pay attention to it.
Right.
And the Mona Lisa is kind of like the greatest example of this of all time, because everybody knows about it, and everybody knows what it is and what it looks like and where it is, and people like make pilgrimages to see it.
Yeah.
And yet it's this tiny little painting, and most people will never look at the actual copy of it.
Yeah.
Like whether or not, like some people don't even think that the one that's hanging in the Louvre is the real Mona Lisa, but whether or not you see some people will never go to the Louvre, some people will only ever see it on t-shirts or books or, whatever. But
maybe someone will have only seen it on your t-shirt. Have you thought of that?
Well, my t-shirt and my book cover.
Yeah, your book cover. Yes.
No, and so it was something that like that in particular was something that started out as kind of a joke as I was writing, and then it became like inextricably linked with the book and is now on the cover. So anyway, it was two different, the tech company and the museum are just two different ways of thinking about the ways that art gets kind of pulled out of your hands as the individual creator and as the individual consumer, the reader or the viewer, which like I don't have a moral judgment of either of those things. I just think it's vexed, and it vexes people's relationship to art. And it's always sort of a struggle to get away from it for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a good, like one of those questions that just like doesn't get an answer, just gets like more questions, like trying to like ask the question about it, like not the right way, but just like figuring out a better way to ask the question. Like that's what that is like kind of seems like to me. But I was also very interested in like, right, if we're talking about the Mona Lisa, we're talking about like very specific art. This is like a book that has like setting like very much in place. And I was interested as like a person who writes like place a lot, specifically like in Florida, which you sunk into the sea.
Sorry.
It's all right. At the bottom of the ocean. But like this is like
I also sank Venice.
yes. It's not just, yeah, you didn't just kill me off. It's fine. But it's like
I'm hoping you guys weren't there when it happened.
sorry. That got me a little but it was like I was very taken with the idea of like how do you write like setting and place in this kind of way, because it's not just place in terms of like the Louvre, right? It's like you're like also like right at this like corporate job like Silicon Valley, like writing this place as well that also is shifting and changing, and also right with the idea of this like slow burn like total like apocalypse kind of shit happening at the same time. And that's a very different kind of writing about place, but also kind of is it right then like the not too distant future.
Right.
Right. Like so I think it's just like I have to ask you about like writing about place. It's just in me. I have to ask that kind of question. But if you would talk about like, because it was like I read an interview that you did where it's like this was always the museum that you had in your head, and it's like this is what it is, this has never changed, this has always been there like from the beginning. But there's like that's like not the only place that's there. So I guess I'm interested in picking your brain a little bit about like how you saw place and like re-envisioning, especially like like being like trapped inside of a building, because the building is not necessarily place.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I thought about it a lot. I mean, the story I told earlier about the private Louvres, like kind of speak in a podcast, is part of why the Louvre was always the place that I was interested in writing. And then just the fact that it contains the Mona Lisa and contains all of this, it just like glows with the gold of fame, shall we say. But I thought about, I'm trying to think how to approach this. Writing the setting in Paris and the setting in the Louvre, a lot of it was very aspirational. I mean, I was thinking about how I would want to experience those spaces, and where almost a virtual reality walkthrough of like, where would I look? How would I look? Where would I go? What would be there for me to interact with? I drew out a map of all of the floors of the Louvre so that I had that in my notebooks and I could always refer to it if I needed to go back to it. And like I said, at a certain point, I became kind of dissatisfied with staying in the Louvre for that amount of time. I think I got it to a place that I liked it, but I realized I felt like I was lacking something, and that was Silicon Valley setting, because so much of, and I think it might have something to do with how I was talking about those two different forms of art earlier, the two different capitalist branches of the museum art and the like tech job art. I was missing this huge chunk of Bertie's life, and a huge chunk of who she was as a person and who she had chosen to be as a person. And one of the ways that she had stuck herself in an endlessly repeating cycle. Like she's stuck in an endlessly repeating day in the Louvre in Paris with this art that is always there, that, the art is always the same, the people viewing it are always changing. But she's also stuck having a day job that she goes back to every single day, which is also always the same. And I thought about when I was working at a tech company and I was living in Chicago, I would, every morning I would get up and I would walk to the train, and I would take the train to the Loop, and I would get off and I would go to the office, and I would be there for many hours, and then I would get back on the train and go. And that sounds boring for me to recite, because it was boring. And it was this, at some point I realized that I felt like nothing. I literally felt like I was living the same day over and over again. And if I made even a single change to like stop and get a coffee before I got on the train, even if that meant taking a later train, or like go to the grocery store before I came home, or go out for drinks or something, it felt so freeing, and it made me feel giddy, like a child who gets to walk to school alone for the first time or something like that. And so I really wanted to tap into that side of Birdie's personality because I knew there was a lot more there. And also having worked in tech and having lived in Silicon Valley, it's a really interesting place to write about. It's a really interesting place to be, because San Francisco has this fascinating, it has the history of the gold rush, it has the history of hippies, and Berkeley, and like, and all of these really at odds kind of cultural legacies that are at work there. And it's a really small space, so you can't build it up too much, you can't add too much housing, and yeah, anyway, so like, now they have these incredibly successful tech companies coming in and pricing out all of the people who used to live there, who were like teachers and worked in a restaurant and worked at the library. So there's just like a lot of built-in conflict to that scene, and there's also a lot of built-in connections to the idea of the apocalypse. So that, like, the idea of writing in the slow apocalypse, as I've called it, that's happening in the book, it sort of emerged as a motif as I was writing, because it's not necessarily it puts pressure on the plot in the sense that Kate's decision to move is made a lot heavier by the fact that there is a lot of like essentially war and climate crisis going on, and once she leaves, Birdie might not see her anymore.
Right.
Like she could literally die.
Right.
But it's also it's there in the background in a way that that, like the structure of the book, is evocative of something in the heart of the book without having to like put a really clear label on it, which is that Birdie and Kate, like so many people, like me, like so many people that I know, are living through this time that is really tumultuous and that is devastating and even deadly for a lot of people. And they're not really doing that much about it, because they can't do that much about it because it's just the structure of the world that they live in. And so like they can make small choices to try to make things better, or they can make choices that might make it worse, like flying to Paris, for example, just because it's like a ceasefire moment. But they're always sort of engaging with that and grappling with that on a back burner level. And that was an interesting way to write about place, because it had to be both really visible and also not too visible, like not dragging attention or focus away, but just sort of like burnishing what was already there. And yeah, and so of course then I had to go to Silicon Valley because that's where all of the Elon Musks of the world live. There have been so many people, like tech people, who have created rocket ships and like failed to send them into space, or sent them briefly into space, since I wrote this book. And that's something that happens in the book. And every single time before the book came out, I was like, time it better. If we're all enthralled to capitalism here, just like use your capitalist impulse to help my capitalist impulse. Come on.
Oh God, well, yeah, damn, right? Yeah, yep.
But they wouldn't.
No, they wouldn't do it. Okay, I have like really held you hostage. We have like 4 questions, so I'm gonna ask you some of the questions from other people, because I can't take up all your time. But this
Another
first
time.
one asks, how does writing comics relate to writing books?
I think so. Kristen pointed at something in a question that I think I interrupted her on earlier, which was about the idea of like giving yourself a project with a book, or like having a writing prompt. And I think that's one way that writing comics and writing a book, at least a book like End of the World House, where they really intersect, because I did have this specific structure in mind, which meant that I had to write within that structure, and everything, like all of the discoveries I was going to make, which were many, had to happen within that framework that I had set up for myself. And that is, like, to me, very challenging but fruitful. And the same thing is really true of comics, because you have this very specific set of rules in which you are able to tell your story, and which are So like, for example, I write a webcomic called Love Among the Lampreys, which is just basically weird animals having metaphysical problems.
And I love it. I love it. I love to receive them in my email. I love to see them. They're amazing.
tinyletter.com/celtadri, CELTADRI.
You're not going to regret it. It's very good.
It's free too. But I've been doing that comic for a really long time, and it provides a weird kind of structure for me in two ways. One of which is that it's literally it's always 4 panels, or at least it's always the same shape. Sometimes I switch up the panels, but it's usually the same 4 panels, which means anytime I do change something, it feels really momentous.
Right.
Like it gives you an automatic sort of breathlessness, or like I said, in terms of End of the World House, it gives you this automatic form of suspense and a framework in which to work so that you're not always just struggling with a blank page. And it also was something that because I do it for the most part every week, I've been kind of inconsistent lately because I had a book come out. You might have heard of it.
You've been a little busy.
Yeah, but usually I do it every week, and that meant I was less precious about it than I might have been otherwise, because if I draw one that I don't like, I know that I'm going to do another one the next week. So I just always was producing something. And I think that can be a really helpful way to think about writing also, especially when you're in the early stages of a draft of a book or a story. Like you just have to keep going. And then for me, they just come from similar places. And I did illustrate this book.
Look at that.
There's 3 illustrations in there. Buy the book and find them all.
That's right. That's a good sell. Look at you. You're marketing yourself. Yeah. Okay, here's another one. Can you talk a little about the decision to make the little tech mascot a dinosaur? Was it intentional to have Birdie continually bring to life a kind of creature that everyone accepts is already dead? I love them and I can picture them so clearly.
Thank you. I'm glad you love the dinosaur. I love the dinosaur. I don't know that I thought about it in terms of extinction, but I was thinking about it in terms of bones. Because I was thinking of, I guess my initial draw to the dinosaur was that tech companies often have this feeling of really like childishness to me. And one way that I have thought about the tech company that I used to work for was that it got big. And this is true of not just that place, but lots of places, because the tech company in the book is imagined.
Yeah.
I'm not writing about anything real. It's all made up. But something that I often see in tech companies, I think, is that they get really big really fast, and they become ungainly in this way where they have good intentions, but they're just so big that they knock into things and they break stuff. And then sometimes their intentions get bad and they eat people.
Wow. Yes.
But also they're like something that's like a toy. It's very appealing. It's very like, and anyone can enjoy it. And it was fun just thinking again in terms of thinking about the book visually. It's fun to imagine, like to picture the dinosaur with a top hat, or the dinosaur reading with Rene Descartes.
I mean, it was fun to think about, like from a reader's perspective, because I feel like I could envision it as well. I was like, oh, okay. Like, it's like one of these things where it's like, how many times can I think about that in terms of jokes sometimes online.
Yes.
But I was like, how many ways can I tell the same thing and get like different level of satisfaction from it, or get a different kind of thing from it? And it felt like that with the little dinosaurs. Like, how many different ways can we play with this? Like, how much can I stretch it? How much can I get out of it? So it was like fascinating to me. I think you could think about the dinosaur like on a metaphor level from like a lot of different things. But okay, here's another question. I'm enjoying this conversation immensely. Thank you. That's nice. Thank you. I have a bit of a fun question. If you realized you were stuck in a time loop, what would you try to do to get out of it?
What would I try? I mean, I think because I'm a novelist, I would naturally try to think narratively about it. Like, what was I doing? What place am I at in my life? What are my flaws? How did I get here? What was I doing just before? What was I planning to do after? what are my, like, why is this obstacle in my way, and how can I change my behavior in order to like trigger whatever it is that I need to, like, whatever personal growth I need to achieve to get out of it.
That's a smart answer, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know what I would do. I feel like I would just keep like reliving the same day over and over again.
Right, like what day is it? Maybe I wouldn't.
Maybe I wouldn't. I feel like sometimes it's like that now even. Jeez. Wow. But I think we have run out of time officially. We had two other questions. One is just saying hello, and one was saying, what podcast do you listen to? So if you have a podcast that you can throw out there really quick.
I listen to so many podcasts. But the one that I have been listening to lately is this BBC production called Uncanny, which is just people's theoretically true life scary stories investigated by a podcaster, and it's really fun. And I listen to it while I'm exercising to keep my heart rate up because it works.
Thank you. That's also just thinking about being stuck. And I mean, doubtless you thought about this writing the book, but just the idea of like, well, if my time loop was in the Louvre, I could finally see everything in the Louvre. Like that would be amazing.
Oh, I mean, actually, what my real answer to that question should have been that I did get stuck in a time loop while I was revising this book. Part of it was the revisions of the book, which kept happening over and over. And then the pandemic happened while I was finishing the book.
Yeah,
and selling it. So I don't know what I did. I guess I tried to finish revisions, so I'm being true to my word. I went to the narrative.
Thank you,
it worked, guys,
so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you for Lola. And but yes, thank you. This conversation was truly a delight, and yeah, thank you for being with us, and thanks those of you listening in and viewing in. Thank you for joining us. The link to purchase the book is there in the chat, harvard.com/book/end of the world house. And thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores.
And it is a great book.
Buy this book specifically.
You will stay in the bathtub all day reading it.
That is so much the bathtub equivalent of missing your train stop. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, and yeah, happy reading and stay safe, everyone. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.